Before cotton fields, before vast plantation rows stretched across the American South, before African chattel slavery became the defining image of bondage in America, there was another system of captivity, one that is rarely discussed, one that reshapes how we understand early America. This is the story of indigenous enslavement, a vast and often forgotten network of human trafficking that predated and coexisted with African slavery in North America. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they entered a world of diverse indigenous nations, societies with their own governments, trade networks, spiritual systems, and diplomatic relationships. But from the very beginning, colonization and captivity were intertwined. In the Caribbean, shortly after 1492, indigenous Taino people were forced into labor under Spanish rule. Systems like the encomienda compelled native communities to mine, farm, and serve colonial authorities under brutal conditions. Disease devastated populations. Violence accelerated the collapse, and captivity became a tool of control. As European powers expanded into North America, the enslavement of indigenous peoples followed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish, French, and English colonists captured native men, women, and children during raids and wars. Some were forced into local labor. Others were shipped to distant colonies in the Caribbean. Many Americans are unaware that native captives from what is now the southeastern United States were sold into slave markets in places like Barbados. Human trafficking was not confined to one coastline. It was continental. In the Carolinas, during the late 1600s and early 1700s, the indigenous slave trade became a powerful economic engine. English colonists in Charlestown, now Charleston, partnered with certain native groups to raid rival nations. Captives were marched long distances, families were separated, communities destabilized. Historians estimate that between 24,000 and 50,000 indigenous people were enslaved in the American Southeast during this period alone. Some were forced to work in colonial households and fields. Others were exported to the Caribbean, exchanged for goods, weapons, or enslaved Africans. The system was complex. It involved European traders, colonial governments, and native intermediaries navigating shifting alliances and survival strategies. But at its core was violence and displacement. In New England, during and after conflicts like King Philip's War in 1675, captured indigenous people were sold into slavery locally and abroad, or some were transported as far as Bermuda. Enslavement was often justified by colonists as punishment for resistance, but its impact went far beyond war. It fractured nations. It altered demographics. It fueled cycles of retaliation and instability. Indigenous enslavement did not always look identical to African chattel slavery. In some regions, native captives were absorbed into colonial households. In others, they labored in agriculture or domestic service. Legal categories varied by colony, but the loss of freedom was real. The trauma was real, and the systems were organized. Over time, as African slavery expanded, particularly in plantation economies, colonial laws hardened around race. African chattel slavery became hereditary and codified in increasingly rigid racial terms. Indigenous slavery did not disappear overnight, but it became less central to plantation economies. Still, native captives continued to be forced into labor well into the 18th century, particularly on frontiers and in Spanish territories. Why is this history often overlooked? Partly because of documentation. African slavery developed into a massive transatlantic system with detailed shipping records and economic data. Indigenous enslavement, especially in English North America, was often decentralized, embedded in frontier warfare or hidden within household labor systems. But its scale and consequences were profound. Entire regions were destabilized by slave raids. Population losses from violence and disease reshaped power dynamics among indigenous nations. Some groups were pushed westward, others were absorbed. Others vanished from written records. The economic foundations of certain colonies were built, in part, on the trafficking of native people. And the psychological impact endured. Imagine a village attacked at dawn, captives bound, and forced to march away from ancestral lands. The uncertainty of not knowing where you are being taken, or whether you will ever see your community again. These experiences were not isolated. They were part of a system that existed alongside, and sometimes intersected with African slavery. In fact, in early colonial America, native and African captives sometimes worked side by side. Over time, colonial elites shifted toward African labor for large-scale plantation agriculture. African captives were seen, in the brutal logic of colonial economics, as more controllable within racialized systems of permanent bondage. But this shift does not erase what came before. The dominant narrative of American slavery often begins with African labor on southern plantations. That story is essential, but it is incomplete. Because before plantations dominated the landscape, before cotton became king, the enslavement of indigenous peoples was already reshaping the continent. This history complicates simple categories. It reminds us that colonial expansion relied on multiple systems of exploitation. It forces us to confront the reality that early America was built not only on African bondage, but also on indigenous captivity and dispossession, and its legacy lingers. Forced displacement policies in later centuries, including removal acts and reservation systems, emerged in a world already shaped by earlier patterns of violence and forced labor. Understanding indigenous enslavement changes how we see early America, reveals a web of captivity stretching across regions. It challenges the myth that native peoples simply disappeared. It shows that colonization was not only about land, but about control over bodies and labor. And it calls us to remember the individuals within that history. The children taken from villages, the families separated, the nations destabilized. History is not just what is most visible, it is also what has been buried. Beyond plantations lies another story, one of resilience as well as suffering, because indigenous nations survived. Despite captivity, despite displacement, despite attempts to erase them, they remain. Their cultures endure, and their histories demand recognition. To understand early America fully, we must widen the lens. We must look beyond the familiar images of plantation fields. And we must acknowledge the forgotten systems of enslavement that shaped the continent long before and alongside them. Only then can the story be closer to whole.